it's a great pleasure to introduce Dan Yamins, our next keynote speaker. Dan is an assistant professor of psychology and computer science at Stanford University, and his research interests lie at the intersection of neuroscience, AI, psychology, and large-scale data analysis. And just looking at Dan's webpage, I saw that his work relies on two main hypotheses, which resonate very much with me. So the first one is that by studying the brain, we can improve, we can take inspiration and improve AI systems. And then the other way around, by improving AI systems, we can also understand better how our brain works. So yeah, I think this this really resonates with me, and I'm really looking forward to Dan's talk.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Today I'm going to talk about one partial success, 4 failures, and what I'm trying to do to recover from them. Or maybe it should be fair to say that the failures were not really failures. There was a lot learned along the way about many things, but I'm going to highlight the way in which some problem has not yet been solved. So look, understanding complex noisy data streams is a critical part of cognition. I mean, you don't have to believe in like the fact that the baby has no like processing ability to realize that there is a blooming and buzzing confusion that we have to figure out about the world. And in particular, in vision, we're all aware that there are some really critical problems, difficult problems there of like being able to see what is where by looking, as you can in this scene in this kind of fast, effortless way. It's known that the brain supports this ability in humans and in non-human primates by a series of brain areas called the ventral visual pathway. So that includes like areas with names like V's, V1, V2, V4. They're kind of hierarchically organized that do some initial processing. And then another hierarchical set of areas in series called inferior temporal cortex, which finally seems to do like high-level visual processing of various kinds. So if you stick arrays in the brain and you record responses to lots of images, as my colleagues have done, and then you try to decode from the brain what you're seeing with linear classifiers to do categorization, you can find that neurons in IT cortex, that area toward the top, the end of the processing pathway, the ventral pathway, do pretty well at high variation performance on categorization, kind of close to human performance and better than areas in the middle, such as V4, and certainly better than old computer vision models. Okay, so what this meant was like about 10 years ago, there's this great like goal that arose that we thought was useful and we could probably have some traction on, which was making quantitative models of neurons in this visual pathway. And at the time, although they hadn't yet become like all the rage, which they were for a bit, convolutional neural networks were an obvious idea for how to approach this problem because they were built to condense kind of the rough neuroanatomy of the ventral stream by being both hierarchical and retinotopic. And so what we found was that if you randomly selected convolutional neural network structures and you measure their performance and their neural predictivity, that there was some relationship between those. Each dot here is like a different model, and there's over hundreds of different convolutional neural network architectures, y-axis being productivity and y-axis being performance on some task. If you optimize the parameters, not just randomly chose them, you could actually do a lot better. That's the blue dots. In other words, you could like drive performance, and you could also get a higher correlation with neural predictivity and be substantially better models of the brain areas. And of course, conversely, if you optimize for neural predictivity, you could do better at that. You could do reasonably well at that, actually not better than optimizing for performance. And you didn't always get performance back. That's the red dots. So the blue dots seemed like a really good bet. And what we wanted to do was go up to the right. And this, by now quite old partial success, was basically that by doing what seemed like heroic optimization stuff at the time involving metaparameter optimization of the architectures and, like all the various things that we now take for granted, in terms of backprop on large data sets, what you could get was, at the time, quite deep 5-layer neural network that was highly performant on visual tasks, and as it turned out, did very much go up to the right. Those are those red dots, red squares there. So we were able to push performance a lot, and in the process, get like one of the earliest quantitative models of a higher level visual area. right? And since then, of course, things have developed a lot. The networks are much deeper. The correspondences between brain areas have been worked out in a much more fine-grained way, with various sub-areas being able to be understood in terms of their hierarchy within the neural networks. And the state-of-the-art models can be ranked quantitatively, and there's, great efforts underway to do that. But I want to focus on this problem, which is that we still want to go up to the right. We want to get better at performance on something at least, and we still don't have perfect models of the neurons, and we'd like to understand why we don't yet map all the responses. Okay, at least as a vision scientist, that's of quite interest to me, right? So, my attack on this over the last number of years has basically been to sort of try to shore up and fix problems in each of the main architectural components of a neural network optimized model. So the architecture class, the task or objective, the data set, and the learning rule, right? So you can think of the result that I mentioned a moment ago as saying that the best proxies for the visual system were these conv nets of some reasonable depth with kind of multi-way object categorization task, using ImageNet images as the data set, and then using some combination of our evolutionary architecture search and filter learning through gradient descent to build the model, right? And you can translate those ideas into neural language if you want, but for our purposes here, we're comfortable with kind of the optimization framework. Okay, each of these things had problems, and they seem to be opportunities to get better models, right? So for example, it was the case that the architecture class conv-nets don't have recurrence and feedback, and the brain does. And the task/objective uses way too much labeled data, and the brain doesn't. ImageNet has fixed images, buffered, and in very particular configurations, and real data streams don't. And of course, backpropagation is not biological in a variety of ways. So this made very natural sense to me. We'll fix things by fixing each of these areas in turn, right? And by that, actually go up to the right again on that scatter plot I showed you before. So okay, the brain has got lots of recurrence. I'm going to talk about each of these areas briefly. So the brain has got lots of recurrence, both local and long range. And so we thought, with my students, we would put some recurrence into a conv-net, basically take a neural network like this and have local circuits of various kinds on long range back connections, right? And indeed, we could, get some performance gains on these relative to their size. So if you have a neural network, ResNet 18 at some performance level and a ResNet 34 at another performance level, right? That seems reasonable. You could get performance by increasing the depth a lot. Of course, the brain doesn't seem to do that by making the head a lot bigger. So the idea that you would sort of trade off space for time in a recurrent version seemed reasonable. And indeed, if you put in various circuits like a convolutional LSTM, you could improve performance. Actually, another kind of circuit, a reciprocal gated unit, which we invented, and certain particular long-range feedbacks were much better at this than standard circuits like LSTMs, allowing us to basically do things like get performance of networks about 2x as deep with the same number of units as the original network. And so, yeah, okay, so we could use recurrence to perform better a bit on the tasks like ImageNet, and also we could make predictions about neural dynamics pretty well. So for example, there are a data set from my colleagues Jim DiCarlo and others at MIT showing that basically challenge images that were hard for standard convolutional neural networks, and there were images that were easy for them, that they got right. And in the brain, actually, interestingly enough, the challenge images were decoded later than the easy images. The animal could get them all, but it took a little longer with the challenge ones. And so what you could do is build this sort of object solution time distribution, a vector per image, that gives a target for asking how well do the neural networks do, the conv-nets or whatever do at predicting the patterns of when the animal will solve it, right? This is kind of neural behavioral metric, right? And it turned out that the key result was that convolutional recurrent networks were substantially better at this. They could both solve the challenge images and they actually had the right pattern of fit to the dynamics, right? And so in particular, the hypothesis arose here that what was going on is a trade-off between physical size and performance. So, really deep feed-forward networks were, in the upper and the right were good at the task, but they were very big. And shallow feed-forward networks were pretty bad at the task. But these convolutional recurrent networks seem to be right at this sweet spot, right? So that was great. But actually, if you look at a per time point, the recurrent networks is not doing any better at predicting neural responses than the original feed-forward networks. They get the dynamics better, but they're not getting the actual neural responses better on a per time point basis, so this is sort of, again, a sense in which I think that it's not that we didn't completely solve the problem. We certainly didn't do that. It wasn't totally okay. We got somewhere. Certainly harder to reject the model out of hand. We were able to make some better predictions of dynamics and some performance increases. But I would say that that was not like a complete resolution of the original problem that I posed, which is actually describing the neural responses. So, all right, well, okay. During this, we turned to another idea, which was that we should really be getting rid of heavy supervision in building models. So, there's really no way that these creatures like babies or macaques or whatever receive millions of high-level semantic labels during learning. Can be an effective proxy for figuring out what's going on, but obviously not quite right. So it was needed in our minds to find some kind of semi or self or unsupervised loss function that's realistically costly, but able to build powerful representations, right? And people have talked about some of this in the workshop, of course. So, how essentially autoencoders were in very shallow versions of those able to produce neuron-like things. This was really deep work from sparse autoencoding in the mid-90s. But that turned out to be hard to generalize, although various variants of it came up, like kinds of predictive coding or contrastive predictive coding methods. And these, it turned out, are sort of okay at some of the categorization tasks, although they're certainly far from the ability of fully supervised networks. And if you look from a neural perspective, what you find is that they're pretty good at describing early areas of the visual network, the visual system like V1, but they have trouble at describing higher areas. More recently, in the kind of like 5 years ago regime, there were a lot of these sort of missing data problems, kind of along the lines that the previous speaker just implied, such as these, inpainting of various kinds, and colorful image colorization was one of these that is particularly attractive. You rip off the color channel and you have your black and white input, and then you colorize it. And the representation learned by doing that has some power. And in fact, it's better at various tasks, such as, categorization, transfer, position, or object size estimation. And it's better at predicting neurons in V4, interestingly enough. So you're sort of climbing up the chain here. But there's still some real trouble in getting the whole, especially the higher areas like inferior temporal cortex, right? So in the last few years, however, there's been some substantial improvements here, basically contrastive methods that essentially seek to push together things that are similar under some augmentations and push apart things that are different. And we ourselves had a version of this called local aggregation that was introduced by my amazing student who's now moved on to MIT, Cheng-Shu Zhang, in a series of papers. The local aggregation idea was essentially a sort of flavor of contrastive learning. I won't get into the details of it, but basically what it was doing was kind of using kind of a clustering idea to allow for things beyond just standard augmentations to give positive examples. And at the time, this network was actually the first one to be better than supervised AlexNet using an unsupervised method. So, that's an arbitrary threshold, but it showed that these networks were really, the unsupervised methods really sort of coming into their own. And indeed, they could be as nearly as good as neural networks, as the supervised versions in categorization, and actually better on other types of tasks that they weren't trained for. Okay, so the question was, how good were these things at matching neural data? And Cheng-Shu had this really sort of tour de force paper in PNAS a couple of years ago, looking at unsupervised neural networks models of the visual pathway. And as it turned out, the contrastive methods were finally able to get to the point where they could be as good as supervised networks at predicting neural responses, right? So that's like the red bar here that I've highlighted in green is like a little bit higher, not too much higher than that black bar, the supervised version. But this was really beginning to get, quantitatively accurate unsupervised models of a higher brain area. That felt like a big triumph for us at the time. And, also there's a kind of neural quantitative anatomical mapping consistency that emerged. Earlier layers of the models were better at predicting early brain areas, intermediate layers were better at predicting intermediate areas, and higher layers of the model were good at predicting higher brain areas. So that was good. But there's still a gap there, right? We're far from actually the noise ceiling of the neurons. And actually the unsupervised methods were not better than the supervised method, right? I was thinking, we'll get rid of this abiological thing and we'll have something that's better at predicting brains than previous things that had the abiological thing in them. Not better. And so I think that was quite instructive. So again, I think we're sort of okay-ish there. A lot of progress in a certain sense, but still not totally resolving the problem, right? So maybe it was the data, right? And of course, this is what real data streams that you actually learn look more like, certainly not framed images, still images. So what we did was we took a data set that I think is really a beautiful thing produced by, among others, my colleague, Mike Frank here at Stanford, called the SACAM data set. So this is basically data from an infant where there's a head cam, a couple of infants, and they were followed from 6 months of age to 32 months of age with this head-mounted camera, mono, video, and audio channels, a couple hours a week. So it's on about a 50th of the data that they would see in that period. So certainly not the full thing, but it's pretty rich. And the data in that looks like this. So that's to say, it's in some sense harder than learning from ImageNet because it's online versus buffered and randomized. It's got many fewer distinct types of objects in it, like there's not 1,000 cups, few cups, but from a wider variety of viewpoints. So in some sense, it's less diverse than the type of data that we're typically thinking about learning with, right? And so we wanted to use this data to learn a representation. And the obvious idea, following on the things I just mentioned to you, was to extend the sort of contrastive embedding approach to video. And that's what Sungshu did. So in particular, built a model that had both a static stream for processing single images and a dynamic stream for processing image sequences, and built a video instance embedding framework. And at the time, this was quite good at being able to do transfer learning to action recognition and other things, right? So from a computer vision point of view at the time, we felt quite pleased with this. And then we stuck the SACAM data, the baby head cam data, through the model and trained it. And what we found was that, these are now the red bars labeled VIE and SACAM. And what we found was yeah, they were actually quite a bit better than previous things that could process video at making neural-like representations. So for example, standard implementation of predictive coding, that's the orange bar, was much worse than this kind of contrastive video embedding idea. And there was an advantage of video frames compared to still frames alone, suggesting that temporal coherence was playing a role, okay? And that's good. Okay, so these deep contrastive embeddings were trained on infant head cam data and yielded models that were reasonably good. But actually, there was still some gap even between training on ImageNet and training on SACAM, right? The sort of more natural data, with the ImageNet being a little better. So this hadn't solved the problem. It just made the problem harder in a certain sense, right? I mean, lots of progress made, very proud of the work. But still, it felt to me like there's some, unresolved problems there, where I would say that things are mostly okay-ish. I mean, definitely progress being made, but not clear that these ingredients, by making them more neural-like or improving performance according to them, actually gave us a better model of how visual processing was really occurring. So of course, there's the learning rule problem, and that could be an entire conference in and of itself just to talk about that. I mean, there's so much to say that there. And I'm maybe not the only one contributing to that by any means, but what we did in our work was build variety of more biological types of learning rules, overcoming some of the issues with backprop to some extent. I mean, actually to a large extent at this point. And I'm not going to have the time to belabor all of the details there, so I won't. But what I will say is that I will ask the question of, hey, do the biological learning rules fit the neurons better? Okay. And on the x-axis here in different brain areas, V4 and IT, there's a whole bunch of different possible learning rules. In fact, the standard one like backprop, and then a bunch of other ones, some of which perform about as well as backprop nowadays. But actually, they don't fit the neurons better, okay? Right? It's not like they're not doing something more biological. Probably they are at some synaptic learning level, but they're actually not producing a substantially better representation. They're just sort of producing the old thing, but with a less objectionable rule. Okay, so I won't say that situation is in learning rules is okay. I think that's still pretty bad, in terms of what's not understood there. But it seemed to me that through all this, right? So basically, I in my last few years, we've carried out this research program of actually making a lot of progress on each of the core ingredients of deep learning models to make them better in a variety of ways. And as both part of our work and work from the rest of the community, that actually has been very successful in its own way. So I could give a talk about why this was great, but what I think was most interesting to me was that the original thing that I kept thinking would happen would be, we'd get better models of the neurons in some quantitative sense on a per time point basis, basically saying, these neural models are improved, has been a little bit, I haven't seen that actually happen yet. So the alternative strategy is to try to really solve some new types of tasks that humans have do that models don't, right? And I should say before doing it, there's lots of other things we tried to fix it that don't. Like GANs, at the time they were interesting, and transformers and CLIP and Dolly, so far as we can tell, although we can only limitedly test that one. And then a whole bunch of other self-supervised things, right, that many people here will probably be familiar with in a variety of ways. Some of these are slightly better at performance, some of them are slightly worse. None of them make substantial dent on predicting neurons better. And most of them are actually slightly worse. Like, for example, transformers are a little worse at predicting neurons in the visual system than convolutional neural networks. So, okay, so that suggested to me that what should really happen is that we should move towards really solving some visual tasks that have yet to be resolved. So, mostly in the context of a kind of agent-based setup. So basically you have an agent in an environment doing perception and acting back on that. And a lot of the tasks that I find inspiring and that I'm trying to work on from a kind of AI point of view, and then hopefully from those get better neural models, are world modeling problems. So the problems of the form, what happens next if I take some action A, okay? And one of the ones that tasks that's most inspiring to me, and that I'm sort of thinking about as being a good bet, would be modeling intuitive physics. So, not necessarily physics per se, but all of the machinery necessary to be able to understand forward prediction the way humans do from images. And so, experimental results have shown from people like Liz Spelke that humans, babies have physical intuition that's quite accurate very early, and not just for simple situations, but for complex scenes, like what will happen if many small things roll out of a larger thing, or what will happen when you deform a very complex material. So toward making models that could actually do this, what we did was build intermediate for physical prediction that would, putting aside the vision problem for a moment, try to understand what the right representation there is. And this was work jointly with Nick Haber, Fei-Fei Li, Josh Tenenbaum, and others, led by my student Damien Rotze. And the outcome here was the idea that we would represent things in the world with particle representations. So, objects were basically graphs where the nodes would correspond to particles and the edges would correspond to relationships between the particles. And these edge labels are labeled by some kind of vector describing how the relationship is configured. Of course, now humans don't think about all the particles in a scene all at once, right? So it made a lot of sense to hierarchicalize. Basically, imagine that you could, have a detailed level of description if you wanted to at some times, but also have aggregates that you could think about most of the time, and that would be the basis for efficient processing. And so what we did to learn models in this context was build hierarchical graph convolution, right? And I won't belabor the details of the hierarchical relation network, but basically what it was trying to do was learn how to make correct momentum updates from a given hierarchical graph state. And the network would learn to interpret the graph structure along the way. And so the sort of kind of learned physics models that would come out of this were pretty powerful. They were able to make models of a deformable cone bouncing off the floor, or a complex rigid object like the Stanford bunny, multiple rigid objects colliding, or more complicated interactions like high friction things, like constant friction things, like something rolling, or even more complicated interactions like a floppy teddy bear bouncing off the floor and recovering. And so learned models were able to kind of handle all of these situations, folding cloth, knocking over a tower. And the reason they were able to do this was because even across material type, the graph structure, the graph convolutional kernel is able to learn how to handle all those interactions, not perfectly, but in a way that might be consistent with human performance. So actually, that was the question. Were they consistent with human performance patterns? And so in a kind of effort of cognitive AI benchmarking, colleagues and I have built this evaluation called fission, which is essentially evaluating physical prediction from humans and machines. And the fission data set has a bunch of different scenarios for physical interaction, like supporting, colliding, various kinds of things, right? And this was operationalizing physical understanding by saying, okay, you've got to be right at making predictions across a wide variety of scenarios, right? And the task that you had to be right at was object contact prediction. So basically, will one object, in this case, the red object, hit the yellow object after the event. And the idea would be that, like, if you understood physics, you'd be able to tell that that contact would occur, right? And so we measured hundreds of humans and thousands, tens of thousands of scenarios as to their ability to make this kind of prediction across, as I say, hundreds of scenarios. We also built lots of models of various kinds based on both computer vision versions, one's going for vision and one's not. And what we found by trying to then decode the dynamics of object contact from them was a couple of really interesting results. So first of all, humans were pretty good. They were not perfect at this, but they were pretty good. They were way above chance. Most pixel-based models, forward prediction pixel-based models, are pretty bad. Although ones that built in a little bit of, sorry, let me skip through that animation. Ones that built in a little bit of object-centric understanding were a bit better. The scene graph models that I mentioned a moment ago, there's a whole series of them that came out. The particle-like ones were actually kind of reaching towards human performance, right? So that was really good. That suggested that, those models that how to sort of understand parts and their relationships were able to make predictions about forward predictions in a reasonable domain. But of course, that leaves open an extremely deep problem, which is how would you actually extract the graph description from real-world video, right? And that perception problem is very far from solved. And we've made some progress on it in a variety of ways, and I'll tell you a little bit about that for a few minutes before wrapping up. But in particular, where our goal has been, among the things, to try to learn physical graph representations from visual scenes, right? Be able to take a scene in and then produce out a 3D graph embedding of some kind that describes it. And one approach to this was the physical scene graph approach, where essentially you would try to understand what the objects were by building in a kind of graph-like, physical scene graph-like bottleneck for an autoencoder. And that's what the physical scene graph network did, both by feature extraction, graph construction, and then kind of graph rendering out, which you could then compare to images and train the network, right? And I would say it was not amazingly performant, but it was way better than some other things at unsupervised understanding, especially in, say, segmentation tasks. But because of the fact that it wasn't as performant as we'd like, it's still something that we're working hard to try to do, is get better unsupervised segmentation in real world images. And so actually here at ECCV, we have our most recent version of doing this. This is in collaboration with Jiajun Wu and Josh Tenenbaum, and really led by my intrepid postdoc, Dan Baer. You should go see the first author's talk if you can about this. I think this is a really interesting out direction here, because what we really want to do is be able to do unsupervised category agnostic segmentation of from static images of real world objects, real world situations, like, for example, this bridge data set, which is a robotics data set that has been developed, and we'd like to be able to do it in data sets like that. So the main idea behind this approach and our so-called Eisen algorithm is that it is trying to, again, go back to the ideas from cognitive science. We would like to be able to extract Spelke objects. So that is to say, learn how to extract from single images the boundaries of things that move together, Spelke objects, collections of physical stuff that will go together under everyday physical actions, right? And again, cognitive scientists have shown that this is pretty powerful approach that people are able to do in early months of life. So the natural approach is to extract optical flow in some way, and then use that to learn how to do it from static contexts, okay? But there's two challenges. One of them is that motion is sparse. So if you try to learn which pixels are moving, you get into trouble, because most of the time you'll be seeing false negatives, things that are not moving that could, okay? So you have to overcome that. And the other problem, and that's in the same video later on here, is that there's actually apparent motion correlation, because in this case, the robotic arm is picking up a top, right? And the top only moves when the robotic arm moves it. But it's not because the top is part of the robotic arm, but it's because inanimate objects don't move themselves, right? So you have to learn how to deal with that problem if you want to, in the real world, be able to use this kind of Spelke object, movable object principle, okay? And so that's what we do with our recent work in the Eisen network. Basically, we learn how to estimate a pairwise affinity-based segmentation that can actually learn from sparse motion. When you're doing pairwise things, you don't actually get false negatives. And so that's much better for learning that kind of structure. And then a kind of bootstrapping iterative teacher-student scheme for being able to essentially explain away correlated motion. Once you've learned the robotic arm, then you can delete it from the motion that you're seeing and understand that the pot top is a separate object. That's the basic principle. Okay, and I won't get into the details of how this is done. You can read the paper, but the recurrent microcircuit architecture for being able to actually construct the affinities is something that we think of as having a kind of at least plausible cortical implementation. And it turns out that if you evaluate this, it's able to do better than standard state-of-the-art models when fully supervised. Okay, but the key thing comes that it's dramatically better when supervised and when in this unsupervised motion context, and you get quite strong details in complex simulated scenes, as well as testing on data sets like Bridge, where essentially standard methods really fall down. We're able to get enough power out of the segmentations in these kind of real world robotics data sets that we can actually build control algorithms based on them. And so, you can quantify it if you want to, but the key thing is that actually this type of algorithm is pretty unlimited in terms of the type of data that it can apply to. And, in the process of scaling this up to look at not just like robotics data sets like, these, which are in restricted environments, but also much bigger things like Ego4D and others. So I will skip the last bit so that there's time for a couple of questions, but I will say that I think that there's this emerging hypothesis that flow data can help us understand segmentation, which can in turn help us understand 2.5 or 3D shape, and maybe get us back to physics, with the idea that it will hopefully allow us to explain neural data in the vision system better. And I can't tell you whether it will or it won't, but I think that at least we'll make some really interesting computer vision progress along the way, regardless. So, okay, these are the sponsors who paid for all this, and this is what we do. So thanks, I'm very happy to take some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Daniel, for the wonderful presentation. I'm really learning a lot here. So a couple of questions. So one question in the platform from Mateusz. So you mentioned that the learning rule we use is not biological. What is the challenge here? So if you want to expand a bit on the biological implausibility of backprop and the learning rules that are used there. And Mateusz is also asking, does this matter that we don't use biologically plausible rules?
Well, so okay, what were the problems? That could be like, it's a long discussion, but the basic problem, the main problem that I could tell was that backprop is not local, meaning that it says that if you're going to formulate it as an actual like physical process, that backward connections have to exist that measure the forward connections instantly. Meaning, like, if you actually look at the formula for backprop, it's like saying there are some backward neurons, and those backward neurons have synaptic weights that are the transpose of the forward neurons. Okay, and that's like saying there's a physical process where one neuron knows another neuron's synapses directly. And the neuron doctrine tells us that essentially one neuron can only know another neuron's activity. It cannot know its internal state. That is to say, its synaptic weights. But backprop requires that to occur. And there doesn't seem to be a physical mechanism for doing that. And to me, that's one of the things that I've been able to put my finger on as to something that, like, if there were an immediate instant mechanism for tying forward and backward weights, we'd see it by now, okay? However, there's lots of ways around that, like figuring out like sort of slower methods by which neurons can use activities to measure another neuron's weights. And then basically, you can do reasonably well by doing that and replacing backprop. And, I think my results, among other people's results about backprop and trying to replace it, actually suggest that no, now I'm going to your other question, right? It doesn't matter, right? I'm actually not that concerned about it. This is why I didn't talk too much about it, especially is because, like, at the end of the day, it's very hard to know what's going on in the brain at this level of detail. I think it's quite likely that some kind of quasi, backprop-like thing is occurring. It's hard to know it by the measurements that neuroscientists can take. Very likely, I think that computer vision and other AI has learned something here that's like ahead of what the neuroscientists can tell. And at some point, maybe they'll be able to measure it. But like, I kind of don't Yeah, no, I don't think this is going to fix the problem. That, what is the problem? We would like models that actually model the neural responses of the brain. Putting aside the learning rule, we want to be able to have this types of representations that the brain uses. That's very important because the brain is good at stuff and we'd like to be able to mimic that, right? But getting the learning rule itself more detailedly correct, I don't think that that's the future of how to resolve that problem.
So maybe just a follow-up on that. Given how different the biological tissues are, like the biological neurons are from the digital devices that we use for our neural networks, how likely it is that we would actually be able to mimic the activity of the biological neurons?
Well, I think it's quite likely. I mean, I don't think there's any reason why we can't get artificial neural networks to like have response patterns that are similar to the ones that we observe in the brain. Because I mean, certainly like there's no like expressivity problem, right? And we know that the target, like, let me distinguish like biological details that don't matter, perhaps like exactly the details of the neural, firing, like neural, like low level neurophysiology, from like having a representation that has a lot of the same powers, right? Clearly, the first thing may or may not be relevant. The second thing probably is. I don't think there's any in principle reason why we can't get there. It's just like saying, we haven't solved all visual tasks yet, right? Should we? Yes. Can we with neural networks? Maybe. And as we do, perhaps we'll get better models of the neural response patterns, the neural representation. Whether or not the fine-grained details need to be there, I kind of at this point doubt it. But
one more comment. So actually, Matt Bodvinik was in the call earlier to give a keynote. So I just wanted to mention a comment that he made in another discussion, because you mentioned that in your work you found that it's harder to learn from videos compared to learning from images, whereas at least I do think that there's more information in videos to extract because there's the temporal dimension there. However, Matt was saying, okay, when we actually have images, there's some supervision there already because people take pictures only to things that matter, only to objects, and the images are nicely centered. So there's already a lot of signal there. Whereas in videos, we have a lot of motion blur. So obviously, it will be harder to extract the useful information from a video. So I don't know if you have, or maybe Matt, if you want to comment. I see that you are online. If you want to comment on this.
Well, I can briefly comment, which is just to say the thing that to my mind has made the learning from real kids videos harder is not that it's video as opposed to stills, although that may be true and everything that you just said might be right also. But the real issue is that in actual real video data streams, the nature of the data is quite different and in many ways is less diverse, right? Like, real individual kids don't see 1,000 cups. They see like the same darn cup from like a lot of angles, right? And if you take even today's best unsupervised learning algorithms and you try to learn like, in a non-buffered, in an online way from these, they can actually have real trouble with the low diversity environment. So, the real world environment ought to make models that are more like the brain, but it poses a harder learning problem because of the nature of the data. So it's like saying somehow humans are learning richer representations from sparser signals, than our algorithms are able to handle. Although you're right, it may be true that the video has its own problems, but I also agree that obviously there's some valuable information there, like flow, like I've said, and the other thing, you want to learn about segments, well, it's good to look at flow in video. So I agree that the temporal ordering is very useful.
Matt, if you want to add something.
No, well, I mean, I agree. I think video is better if what you're comparing it against is stills from the same videos, right? That's one way of summarizing it.
Yeah, except that, of course, comparing the stills from video or the temporal signal from video, real video, to the stills of ImageNet turns out to be a really stiff comparison, right? ImageNet has a lot of power in it, with millions of examples, basically, right? And that's like quite different. Those are highly, a batch of ImageNet is highly variable in a way that a batch of this type of data is not. And that really gives trouble for most unsupervised learning algorithms, especially recent ones that don't have negative samples actually really have trouble in this environment. And so, my student Chungsu, or former student Chungsu, has a recent new paper coming out in NeurIPS about the difficulty of trying to do self-supervised learning in low diversity environments like these real world examples are coming from. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So I hope you'll be able to join us for the panel discussion so we can continue there this conversation.